Uh, Thanks a lot. It's nice to be back. I have graduated from debate 8 years ago, which was a great choice for me. So it is slightly weird to be back as well because I'm not really in debate mode anymore. I now look at arguments as they appear in real life, and that often, as you will know, is very different. However, I have tried to make this a little bit more tailored, so hopefully it's useful to debate, but I won't be giving this as a case study for like, what do you do in this motion? What do you do in that motion? And overall, this was just a kind of random idea that me and Rokas had of what I could talk about. The reason why I'm doing it is not because it's the most important topic necessarily, but it is a topic that comes up. I mean, it comes up in public life in Lithuania now more than before, but also in debate. And it is an interesting one to look at because we're kind of entering a world where, parts of it have accepted some requests for LGBT rights, some have not. So we're going to kind of look at what that world looks like, what has the LGBT rights movement achieved so far, where it happened, but also, what were kind of the trade-offs and the consequences of achieving it in the way that it happened, particularly for places that maybe don't have a very high level of proliferation of LGBT rights. This topic I chose as well personally because it's an important one for me. I myself am queer. I'm quite out in Lithuania. I do talk about that quite a lot, or used to talk about that a lot, now much less in the public sphere, writing articles and kind of arguing with various people on social media since basically 2014, 2015. So it is something that's quite close to me. I do think that I have a pretty good grasp of it. I've experienced kind of living as a queer person in many different countries and even continents. I've lived in Singapore for 8 years. I lived in the US cumulatively for about a year and a half. I now live in the UK in London. And obviously I grew up in Lithuania until I was about 20 years old. So at any point, I not only would allow, but would encourage you to ask me questions about what's happening. I will also try to make this interactive. So I really, really hope that you have your kind of fingers on the unmute button so that you could join in the conversation when I ask you things. There's no wrong answers. I love a wrong answer because oftentimes it will prompt me to maybe speak about something that I haven't considered. Because obviously I only know the correct answers in most things in life. So it's nice to have that perspective. But yeah, make sure that you're kind of ready to join in the conversation. If you're unwilling to talk and hate the sound of your voice, you can type out some of your answers as well as we go through. And also feel free to type out and questions that are not directly about what I'm talking about. So we have all of them as they come and as you think of them, and then we can maybe answer them at the end because there's going to be a Q&A. And obviously later on, if you just want to ask me questions about what I did as a debater, I've done debates for quite a long time. From 2009, I started at school. I was in ninth grade. I then did it throughout uni, basically until graduating. I think I stopped in my last semester. So I have maybe something to say as an old person about all of these things. My memory is not very good about them, but I will try my best to answer and maybe, tell you why you should stop debate as soon as possible and not waste your time and things like that. But yeah, maybe what we can start with is not actually discussing the topic itself just yet, but if you could just type in your age and how long you've been doing debate. It's just useful for me to kind of know that background context of, whether you're just starting out, whether you're quite advanced, and it'll give me an idea on how this should go. Yeah, you can just type it in the whole chat. Age and how long you've been doing debate. So two numbers each. This you should know the right answer to, so it shouldn't be that difficult. Oh, God, you're old. 18 years. Okay. Great. I mean, this is great to know. Huge range. I tend to speak quite quickly, and I will speak more quickly now because I think I have prepared slightly too much, but maybe I'm wrong. Um, So sorry about that, but it's recorded, so you can watch it back. If you feel like you don't understand something that I'm saying, but you really want to kind of paraphrase in a different way, I can also say it in Lithuanian. That's totally fine. Don't be shy to ask, especially if you're like 15, 12. You don't, have to have this kind of level of um, ability to juggle all of these terms at this stage. So don't worry too much about that. Um, great. 6 years and 17. Jesus. Um, cool. Let's start with kind of the history. I think it's really hard to talk about what's happening now when the LGBT movement has quite accelerated over time in some parts. It's hard to talk about it without the history. I think this is going to be kind of a basic reminder. It will be good for me to know as well what you kind of know about it too. Since these are relatively older things, maybe they don't talk about it anymore as much. But we can start with kind of the history of, why, where, and how they, as in like LGBT people, queer people, I'm going to use that interchangeably, by the way, how they fought for their rights. And yeah, so who knows, when do we consider the Western contemporary queer rights movement to have begun? What is the starting point? Um, and maybe if somebody wants to answer, tell me what happened that it began. One of you must know. I'd refuse to believe otherwise. Right? So it was an event that kind of sparked a long-standing movement. That's when all the prides started happening in a sense, because it was that month, I think. I'm so comfortable with silence. Don't test me. Okay, I'm not that comfortable with silence. I refuse to believe you don't know, but it was Stonewall. So the Western kind of LGBT rights movement, obviously, it's not to say that that's when LGBT people kind of appeared. It is also not the time when LGBTQ rights were conceptualized, nor was it the first fight for it, but it is definitely the most well-known kind of historic event that a lot of queer people in the West, especially in the US and UK, would trace kind of their memory to. So in 1969, there was a bar in New York that was basically a gay bar. There were a lot of drag queens and trans people there. And at the time, it was kind of legal to detain LGBT people, and especially when the bars usually didn't have drinking licenses. So it was a frequent target for the police already, and one day the police tried to arrest people there, and a lot of the queer people there fought back. So there was a huge riot that broke out in the bar, and that was kind of the starting point of, the whole Pride movement that eventually became a yearly thing in many cities, Vilnius included, and Kaunas included now as well, where queer people march through the streets, kind of asking for their demands or, having a celebration if they believe that their demands have been met, even though there's probably no such country where that happened. Um, that's not the only forms of, well, that wasn't the only kind of beginning of the queer rights movement. There was a lot happening in the Weimar Republic, for example, in Germany, just before Hitler took power. And basically what was happening is that there were institutes that were studying the psychology and kind of the health and other things, sociology about LGBT rights. There was a very vibrant nightlife in Berlin. And then in other countries, there were homophile movements, which were basically like movements that were saying that they're in support of mostly gay people at the time, although trans people were sometimes included into that as well. So those things existed, but obviously, especially when it comes to Germany, World War II did a number of things that were not great. People were incarcerated in camps specifically for being gay under Hitler's um, rule of Germany, along with Jews, but separately, and they were given separate signage, which was the triangle, etc. So that movement really kind of was destroyed. And a lot of the literature, a lot of the culture around it was physically destroyed as well through burning and other means. So Stonewall was really kind of the big reignition of that after World War II. Mostly happened in the US, which was obviously, kind of world leader at the time in terms of just the space it occupies as a power. Um, and yeah, what can somebody tell me, what are the things that the LGBT rights movement in the past or now want? Um, it's not one thing. It's going to be many things, but just shoot a message in the comments on what are the goals? What do we want to achieve? Yeah, great. Rights to get married, adopt, anti-discrimination laws. Great. How about we talk about that a little bit, Orea? If you can unmute yourself, what would you say? What does it mean, anti-discrimination laws? From what?
From people that uh want to cause them violence and uh not allow, for example, to go into a bar
Mhm.
or to work in a certain place due to their sexual identity or gender identity.
Yeah, fantastic. So it's violence. So you would have kind of like basically additional punishments for targeting people specifically because of their sexuality. Hate speech laws, good example. Labor discrimination laws, very good example. This is very now, right? What do you think? So can somebody tell me what were some of the things they were asking for, let's say 30, 50 years ago? Because this was 69 was what? 6 years ago almost. What could be the things that they actually didn't have then that they would need now, that they would ask for? Sorry, not need now. Yeah, but you're not allowed to speak with them. Somebody else. I think they saw that. But healthcare is great. And what happened such that healthcare was so important for LGBT people and when? I actually know this for a fact that some younger people no longer seem to be as aware of this, which is mind-boggling to me. AIDS happened, yes. But you're also, well, fine. But come on, everyone knows this, right? So like the AIDS crisis happened, it started in the 80s, it accelerated into the 90s, it disproportionately affected people. But there were like much more basic things, there are still countries like that, but especially in the US in the 60s, in the UK, there was, uh, oh, great, great. Wonderful, other Augusta. Not a common name, so didn't expect there to be two. Fantastic. Um, the AIDS crisis happened. That's a very, very important thing. I would start way back. Decriminalization. Same-sex acts, not necessarily relationships, although in a way you could say relationships by extension were illegal. And illegal in the sense that you can go to jail for it. A famous person who cracked the kind of code for during World War II for the UK against the Germans, Alan Turing, literally he had to be castrated chemically and then killed himself because it was found out that he was gay and that was still in force. So decriminalization is one. Depathologization, pathologization. So pathology means kind of disease. So it is they were asking basically to depathologize themselves, which means that they would like it to no longer be listed or considered to be a disease. In very many countries, that has at the time been listed as a disorder, homosexuality, transness as well, although that may be a little bit more complicated and still persists now to some extent. But yeah, basically asking for the world's psychiatric and psychological associations to take that off the list of diseases. I mean, equality very broadly in the sense that kind of wanting to integrate into society. Some people wanted to assimilate in society as well. So kind of become the same as straight people. Integration would be instead to be allowed in society, but to keep the traits that you think are quite important to you. Whereas assimilation would be more kind of taking on the life that others expect from you without kind of retribution, etc. Civil rights, somebody mentioned, so marriage equality. Adoption laws definitely is one of them there. Civil partnerships, which is different from marriage, but not fundamentally different as well. And economic rights, yeah. Labor non-discrimination. I think this is quite important. Some things that we'll get into as we talk a little bit more. So I hope that we've warmed up a little bit, and then we can go to this map. It's a lovely map in that it is very sad. It is very sad for many reasons. Obviously, this is where marriage equality is legal. This is not updated. I think there's at least one more country that has accepted it, which is tentatively Thailand. So another one in Asia in addition to Taiwan. Uh, but yeah, can anyone tell me, besides the fact that most of the world doesn't have it, what else is kind of striking about this map? And if you have spoken before, don't worry, speak more. We love a teacher's pet. That's definitely very sad for me, even though I don't live there anymore. I mean, all of Eastern Europe virtually is not in it except Estonia. Anything else? Okay, yeah, interesting observation. Um, I don't think I have a very in-depth case of explaining it. I think it'll be a mixture of both US influence, but also Spanish influence. So a lot of colonialism, but also inherent kind of openness to having sexual communities there with less discrimination from the beginning would definitely help. But these are kind of just guesses on my part. But I think it's an interesting observation for sure. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Brilliant. Exactly. It is very much literally a divide of how you would see the map between kind of the Cold War, USSR versus the USA in a weird way, whether it's by design or not, it is divided under those lines still, even though obviously the Cold War has ended in theory. I mean, South Africa is an exception in Africa because when apartheid ended, it was so bad that they really wanted to extend that level of equality to everyone, and they did that as well for LGBT rights. I think it was the first country in the world to ever include LGBT rights protections in their constitution, and that was 1994, which is brilliant. Yeah, so you can see that kind of division with kind of blips and blobs here, like Italy is just not there. This doesn't include some countries that have civil partnerships and that have stopped at that level. I mean, even Hungary, in theory, has civil partnerships, which is embarrassing given the state of things there now. But yeah, so this is like a very, very important kind of map to just remember and think about. As we go on, we're going to return to this map a little bit to talk about it later. But yeah, let's go back to kind of what are the issues facing the LGBT rights community, because obviously I've shown you a map of where same-sex marriage is legal. And it's interesting that we're already talking about same-sex marriage as the thing that kind of distinguishes whether countries are doing well on LGBT rights. But do you think by virtue of the fact that countries have same-sex marriage, is that necessarily a good place for queer people to live? It could be yes or no. I mean, it's probably yes and no. So tell me a little bit about why. And what are some issues that maybe are kind of hiding that we're really not addressing at all by this? Yeah, the trans community. Very, very good point. Trans rights are quite interestingly separate from same-sex marriage in that if you are allowed to legally become a trans person, you can actually still marry the person of the opposite gender, but you still can't marry the person of the same gender. So same-sex marriage is only an issue, well, not, I mean, directly an issue for trans people who are gay themselves as well and who want to marry the same gender that they are. But if a trans person is a straight person, that would not necessarily be an immediate need for them. Anything else? We've spoken about healthcare, obviously. So that's still hiding under there, right? We've spoken about violence and hate speech. Those are still issues that necessarily are not solved by this map that we've looked at, right? You've spoken about discrimination in the labor force, but there are many, many things that disproportionately affect LGBT people. And I think this is actually like really, really good information for you to know going into any kind of debate, not just about LGBT rights, but minority rights. In thinking about how, often social movements will focus on a thing that's easiest to focus or that's most strategic for them to focus on. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually the right strategy. It doesn't necessarily mean that if it is a right strategy, that it solves those other things. So, civil rights and equality is one of them. But it's not an economic right, and it's not a right that necessarily impacts your well-being day to day, always. So trans rights, so that's usually access to trans-affirming healthcare, such as gender change operations or hormone treatment, etc. Your ability to change gender legally also is a different aspect of trans rights that's not really recognized in this map at all. Homelessness. Not so many people talk about homelessness when they talk about LGBT rights or LGBT communities, but LGBT people are disproportionately affected by homelessness. So if you look at, let's say, all homeless people in the US and UK and Western Europe, it could be anywhere from 11 to 40% of all homeless youth identify as LGBT. So in some countries, literally almost half of all homeless people are queer people, and there's a reason for that as well. But that's definitely something that's quite a big issue. Um, Violence and hate speech, I think that's quite obvious. Uh, can somebody name me a country where hate speech is not banned in particular, but or is rather lax and liberal, but same-sex marriage exists already, or the opposite? Well, the opposite case is Lithuania. You're technically not allowed to. The positive case for, well, not positive, but affirmative case for what I'm saying would be maybe closer somewhere to the US, where in general hate speech laws are a little bit more iffy. And there's a lot more leeway given to the speaker. Discrimination in the labor force is a huge thing. Poor health outcomes, which relates to kind of health discrimination, still relates to AIDS at this point, disproportionately, but not only that. And then mental health issues. So if you look at kind of mental health issues, almost 50% of trans people have thought about taking their own life. Half. That's huge. Like the disproportion with the cis community is massive. 1 out of 8 LGBT youth, so that's from 18 to 24 years, have considered taking their life as well, which is a huge, huge number. Half of LGBT people have experienced depression, and 3 in 5 have experienced anxiety. So more than half have experienced anxiety, which is also a huge number. And those things are not necessarily different in terms of the non-queer community, but they're heightened, and it becomes worse if the culture doesn't address that at all. So I think now that we've thought about all of these things, give me some thoughts and arguments. Was it good to focus on marriage equality, or was it not so good to focus on marriage equality? And this is not a question that really has right answers. Well, maybe, but I think there's sides to both, right? I'd welcome someone to just unmute themselves and give me a little bit of a thoughts on this. Okay, Orea, let's unmute you. Well, you unmute yourself. What does that mean? I mean, I think I understand what you mean, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, so I think that focusing on marriage equality is a bit performative in a way that it doesn't actually address the real problems of the LGBTQ plus community. The most important problems, such as you previously stated, on homelessness and mental health and violence and hate speech, and it more addresses that, like, in a lenient more way, like, here, have something.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does anyone have kind of who could give me an argument for the opposite? Why was it actually good? Either directly against what Odea was saying or independent of that. Luke, I'm gonna call on you, just for uh somebody else to speak, and you've already spoken. So what do you think?
Well, I don't know. I think maybe like focusing on marriage equality means that in the eyes of the cis community, that you like they are brought closer because well, marriage is the corporate thing like which makes a family in their eyes, and
Mhm.
when they see that like all those people can also make a family, well, I don't know. I'm not educated on those issues like that much.
No, that's fine. I think that makes sense to me in the sense that marriage, first of all, it's a complex of rights in within kind of a relationship of two people. So it's not just one thing, right? Marriage incorporates a lot of things from inheriting property and money to uh, freedom of information, the freedom of non-persecution and non kind of not having to testify against your partner, immigration rights, right, through marriage. And also marriage is the one thing that, when we go back to this list, a lot of these do affect straight cis people as well. So they're not unique to queer people, but the kind of civil rights aspect of it is definitely very unique. So in that sense, it could appear to bring more equality by bringing those two communities closer on a playing field. And then, if we're pretty bad at solving mental health issues, well, then it's bad for everyone. It just happens that you're disproportionately affected. Um, I'm just going to read what Dorothea said. It's good because it's an obvious goal people can work towards. It's easy to see. Yeah, I mean, it was chosen partly because they wanted to attach themselves to an institution that was liked in society. It would be hard to argue for labor non-discrimination when there are places in the US where that was just simply allowed for different cases as well. So this was seen as a very kind of all-encompassing, easy marketing technique to latch on to for the community, for the kind of people that maybe are on the fence would be more easy to convince because marriage was seen as such a definite good. So it's really then just a debate of, should marriage be open to all or not, but not like also, is that a good thing? Well, for the most part, that's true. Um, but of course, it also meant that you're sacrificing some things, and we're already saying that, right? And one of the things that's quite important to note is that, when you compare economic versus civil liberty rights, marriage does not pay the bills. To an extent, that might not be true for everyone. You might argue that marriage helps financially. When people are able to sustainably live together, they can get, in the US, for example, tax breaks as a family unit. You can get some financial concessions because of that, but that also only applies to a certain segment of the population. And this is quite interesting, right? Because the US was quicker to give people same-sex marriage, even though it was quite late in that already compared to some European countries. It was quicker to give same-sex marriage than to rule in favor of banning labor discrimination. So only in 2020, don't remember the name of the ruling at this point in time, but basically only then did the Supreme Court rule in favor of people not being discriminated based on their sexual orientation, and only through kind of a weird philosophical argument that kind of being gay is part of gender and we can't discriminate on gender in law. So it was a very interesting creative argument within the limitations of what the US could do. But yeah, marriage was already seen as a privileged institution. If you look at, marriages across like class, where it's most important, where it hides and helps to save the most money, it's going to be for those who are already privileged. So through things like inheritance, through things like immigration, where a lot of people who don't have a lot of money are not really considering those things, marriage might be even more symbolic in a lot of ways, or tax breaks, because you have to meet a certain tax bracket to even be considered for that. And if you're earning a minimum wage, I mean, you probably have the already lowest level of tax breaks that you can have in that system. So yeah, so this is quite important, right? But there are still other things, right? So when we talk about labor discrimination and economic rights, one thing is, ideally nobody should be fired for being a lesbian. Gay too, but that's not the only kind of economic right that we have. Another right that we often see as a fact in Lithuania is that if you go to a store and want to buy something, you should be able to get that thing. So if I want to go get shampoo, I should not be denied the ability to buy shampoo on the basis that I have my nails painted today. So that's not really what's happening in kind of the US, right? Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission was a landmark case where a gay couple wanted to buy a cake for their wedding in a very religious cake bakery, and they did refuse to make that. So the argument devolved into this is art and this is my religious expression, and I can't endorse by providing a cake to somebody who's gay because that means that I'm endorsing their marriage, which is obviously absolutely ridiculous, but the case won. And basically, it is possible that some people will still be discriminated against on their sexuality based on provision of goods. You could think about that in a sense that there are people in the US who are being fired from Catholic schools for being gay or being kind of gay and for openly for LGBT rights. And the argument is very similar there. Slightly different, but similar as well. So these things still exist, right? And you can always have a think a little bit in a debate motion, especially when you're talking about more abstract rights versus like very concrete economic rights. Maybe one is harder to lobby for and be interesting about, such as economic rights. But when you think about the impact that it has, it might have a slightly different level of impact on the population that we're discussing. The other issue when you focus on marriage, somebody correctly pointed out, I think it was Dorotea, no, Orea, that the trans community was sidelined, right? So marriage equality activism does not fundamentally encompass trans rights. Trans people also could have this issue if they're gay trans people, but trans rights are fundamentally separate in a way in that what they face as issues are not faced by cis gay, bi, lesbian people. So that's something that, you know, was a sacrifice, basically, because we do have LGBT, but realistically, you're really advocating for a unique selling point that is particularly valuable for the LGB community. So only in the crossover where the T and the LGB crossover is it that important for them. So that's an issue fundamentally in terms of building a social movement. If you have a social movement that's relatively broad and it advocates primarily for something that absolutely does not encompass one of those coalitions, it is likely that that coalition is not going to be a very active part of that movement, or that they're going to have issues down the line. And the issues down the line are as it got pushed to the side. I mean, a lot of the reasoning why trans rights was not picked up first was to do with the fact that it was complicated. It was complicated to explain to people. It was the prejudice was probably much higher, or if not higher, people just simply didn't really have it in mind to even begin discussing it. Gender, you know, already was only kind of becoming a big discussion point in the 70s and 60s through second wave feminism in that way, and then only third wave feminism kind of 80s, 90s onwards, 2000s onwards, really, kind of encompass trans rights in a more meaningful way. So if you want to explain gender to the population, we have this problem in Lithuania. We don't even have a word for gender, right? And you can see how difficult that is from a social movement perspective to really engage on that topic. But it means that basically it got pushed aside for a very long time. And now if countries do have LGBT marriage equality, right? What happens to trans rights? Because it was kind of branded as the more extreme, more radical ask for a society to have, and marriage was a more moderate proposal. Now trans rights are having the issues that they're having as we are focusing on them. They're basically having very similar arguments against them as gay marriage or gay partnerships did. The issue is, of course, that now they're kind of fighting on it by themselves with some LGBT allies or some straight cis allies. So that is a bit of an issue with that kind of fragmentation in terms of how it happens. And you can see what happens there really is, you know, this organization called LGBT Alliance. So because some gay and lesbian and bi people have achieved marriage equality, which was what they have wanted personally, they don't necessarily have that impetus to advocate for trans rights. So you would see quite a lot of more conservative LGBT people going against trans rights. So that movement has kind of fractured in a way where now as we move on to trans people, some people are simply not interested in that conversation or are openly against it. So LGBT Alliance is an NGO charity founded in 2019 in the UK. And it's basically an alliance of LGBT people that specifically excludes the T. And trans people are excluded from it, and they openly advocate against trans rights. So in the UK, there was a debate on whether we should ban conversion therapy. They proposed that we should ban conversion therapy only on sexuality and not gender identity. So these kinds of things happen. I mean, there's a big fight about it. They are not allowed to march in Pride as an organization because even the corporate Pride in London is quite trans inclusive or trans friendly. I would say inclusive maybe is a strong word for some trans people. But you can see these kind of things coming up that they maybe didn't have the opportunity to come up earlier. And yeah, health rights. I mean, access to AIDS treatment in the 80s up to 2000s, people were dying of AIDS. I mean, really until 10 years ago and still now, but now they're probably dying not because it's inevitable, but because people are afraid or don't know how to properly treat themselves or are afraid to come out or test themselves too late to find out that they have HIV that later progresses into AIDS. But this could also include some reproductive health rights. So PrEP, which is medication that prevents HIV from even infecting a person, right, is only accessible to people for free as part of healthcare in a very, very small amount of countries. I think in the EU, even in the EU, it's, I would say, less than 7 countries, but maybe that's changed since I last checked, including, let's say, the UK, France. Continued support for sexual reproductive health as well, which tends to affect the community disproportionately. And there's quite a few reasons for that, but oftentimes it is as well a reason that people who are discriminated and who are pushed to the margins of society are going to have a lot of these health issues be more prominent in their lives, simply because of, more likely to have abuse of substances because of, let's say, depression or things like that. Being homeless is definitely a huge factor in terms of how risky it is for you to have issues when it comes to sexual health or reproductive health. And mental health access as well. So we spoke about this a little bit as well. And then there's kind of the more radical complaint against marriage in general. So there are definitely people who just simply disagreed that it was even a good thing to advocate for marriage. So arguments there are that marriage is already an institution that is not good for queer people and women. Historically, the argument goes that marriage is an institution that was already unequal. It favored the more powerful in that kind of duo, if it is a duo, and usually those would be men historically. It is a contract that's kind of difficult to leave. There's no explicit need for marriage in society to survive, a lot of people would argue, and by choosing to advocate for it, it is something that solidifies it as an institution and gives it strength. So it was seen that queer people are kind of not, we're different, and we are different because we were so oppressed. So we see relationships in marriage maybe differently, not we as in everyone, but some of us. And therefore, why would we choose to assimilate into society by saying that marriage is necessarily the best thing and that's what we want? So that's kind of the argument that would be a more philosophical distancing from what the LGBT rights movement has chosen. But another thing that happens is if we go back to the map, and somebody correctly pointed out, Dorotea, that practically none of the Asian countries, none of the African countries, and practically none of the Eastern European countries as well have marriage equality, right? And you can see how this map is very divided in the fact that the modern LGBT rights movement has been it has traces its kind of theoretical and social movement roots as it is now in the US, in the UK, in Western countries. So naturally, and because the US was a hegemonic superpower for a very long time, where a lot of what the US has would be put into different contexts, right? And would be diffused over cultures. Um, so yeah, so that's something that is quite important to remember. So what would you say are kind of the issues of when the movement is very Western centric or is from the West for these countries? What's the problem? Why is it bad that it is mostly Western? Come on, you're Eastern Europeans. You should know this. Yeah. And that means that there's more opposition to that idea, not because of the idea itself, but because of where it comes from. So that could be one. Movements put their attention on other Western countries. Uh-huh. Yes, Dorothea, we'll get to that in a moment. Local movements put their attention on other Western countries. I mean, yeah, if you find it that it's easier for you to have a pride in France and in Vilnius, people are unwilling to do it, the international movement is going to support that pride. That's easier to do. I would say that that's reasonable. But there are many other ways, right? So like if one thing is you could say our culture is different, so therefore the Western model is not relevant. So there's often a very like denial of the fact that there is homosexuality, that homosexuality is a Western thing, that issues are not relevant to like India and Russia. And we do see that argument a lot. We see that argument in Lithuania, or that, there are gay people because of it's coming as a corruption and decadence of the West. Another thing is that you could say that because we focus on marriage is not the same in all countries. I mean, in most countries, marriage is two people getting married, but family is really can be a much broader, much more complicated context in different countries, where people live in the same house and they have multi-house families, for example, and all of your aunts and uncles and your grandfathers live there, grandparents live there. That's a very different context. And if you focus on marriage, if you focus on a very kind of two-person, one-child nuclear marriage, two-person, two-children nuclear marriage, it just simply doesn't carry its weight in a lot of countries that maybe have a different approach to that. Um, and then, of course, family values, it means, and marriage means that this becomes a disproportionately cultural and religious debate. If it's about labor rights, that would be a slightly different debate where it's like, oh, people should be able to get jobs and it doesn't matter. But when you enter into marriage, that conversation becomes saturated with religion. And in countries where religion has a greater hold on kind of public opinion, that becomes a problem, or culture where arguments can be non-religious. Um, so what you get then is countries try their own kind of localized movements to act for LGBT rights. I'm actually going to go a little bit faster on this and just talk about the Lithuanian approach. So in Lithuania, obviously, advocating for marriage is not even, we're not even talking about that. And the reason for that is because the way our constitution is made, but also the social attitudes. So the way the social movement does it doesn't actually work in Lithuania. We've tried our best with partnerships, and that was miserably difficult. So a lot of the activism in Lithuania in the past has been through courts and legislation that is institutional, right? So L against Lithuania, it was a court case in the European Court of Human Rights. That basically a person whose name was L, shortened for anonymity, sued Lithuania because they were trans. Lithuania actually allowed people to be trans, but didn't have a way for you to change gender. So L sued Lithuania, L won, and Lithuania was forced to change their gender. However, we never passed a law that says now you can do that. So every time a trans person wants to change their gender, they effectively have to go to the court. And the court will automatically say you can change it, but it makes things very difficult. But in a way, that's how we have that right, through an institutionalist approach by using the courts in Europe. The same happened with our non-discrimination and anti-hate speech laws. The only reason we really accepted it was because the gay rights movement, LGBT rights movement in Lithuania leveraged EU accession. So when we were joining the EU, that was one of the requirements, and we fulfilled that requirement by just adding it in. To date, that is the only positive advancement in LGBT rights in Lithuania in our parliament, where people have voted on it. There was not a single other law from my memory that has been passed in our parliament that is for LGBT rights. Everything else has been in courts. So same for Matseta against Lithuania. Matsate, actually, sorry, is Neringa Dangvida is her real name. This is her pen name. She wrote a book about two princes, I think. And then they were obviously in a same-sex relationship. That book got banned under the law that was passed in 2012, that same-sex partnership depictions are harmful to minors in Lithuania. It was just a few years ago or a year ago ruled as not actually a correct application of law, and also not adhering to human rights charters, etc. So that's something that just happened now. And that's how we kind of practice our rights in a very frustrating, but at least in a way that we get it. Pink dot, I'm not going to get into it. You can Google it. I'm sure you're going to get the slides later. Another thing that we get is when it becomes very Western, but also becomes more accepted in the West, is we get something called homo nationalism. So I'm going to leave this quote and I'm going to give you 30 seconds to read it. This is an anthropologist, so you're not going to understand anything she's saying, and that's fine. But maybe somebody can give a stab and try to say, what does homo nationalism mean? Apparently we have more time, which is great. So yeah, what is this nonsense? I am going to call on somebody if nobody else says, but it would be nice to hear somebody new.
Can I speak like this instead of writing?
Yeah. This is yeah. Please unmute yourselves and just talk.
Yeah, I
Yep.
think it's what the crazy French lady, Le Pen, that's her name, is trying to do when she builds a lot of her anti-immigration rhetoric on like safety of people and alleged ideas that immigrants are like criminals and dangerous, and especially dangerous to like women and queer people. So I think it has to do with that.
So who are you? What's your name?
Yogaila.
Yogaila, great, because I can't see who's speaking, sorry. Great example. So maybe you can try to rephrase this. What could homo nationalism mean as a process? And what do you need for it to work?
Like, okay, what do you need for it to work?
So why is it like a thing now, but we didn't have it as a thing 60 years ago, right? So something has changed. What's changed? in the 60 years now that even like fascist politicians like Le Pen are using sexuality as an argument, a positive. Yeah. Okay, so let's, Dorothea, you can go ahead because you've actually spoken about this a little bit as well earlier.
Okay, so in recent times, the acceptance of the LGBTQ community has kind of become just more mainstream. Like the belief that gay people deserve rights, that has become more mainstream overall. And it's kind of become synonymous with the West and just being civilized as a whole. If you're civilized, you believe in women's rights, you believe in gay rights pretty much. And because like in Marine Le Pen's the Marine Le Pen example, they're trying to be really against immigrants. And what they're doing to kind of excuse being against immigrants to this point is that they really try characterizing immigrants as being these uncivilized people who don't like women, who are so far away from the West that they
What
just
kind of immigrants?
from more so the East, from Africa, from Asia, and they show them as being so far away from the West that they cannot, like in any way, shape, or form, come into our society because they are going to ruin everything. And they are using the LGBTQ community and the mainstream normalization of accepting gay rights to kind of further
Yeah.
their what they're trying to say about immigrants.
Yeah, that's absolutely kind of a perfect way of encapsulating it. Thank you both, because you both really helped us explain that. The reason why homonationalism can exist now and didn't earlier is because earlier LGBT rights were not accepted. So because they were mostly associated with the left, of course, very rarely at the time used arguments against immigrants in general, and the right did. But the right already kind of didn't like the gays, right? So why would they say something positive about the gays to say something negative about somebody? At the time, it wouldn't have made a political sense. Now they know that that battle is lost and they want to bury it. And that's something that, in a lot of these countries, really hard to go back, even though you can, and they will try. But a lot of these parties, like if you look at Le Pen's father, who is like absolutely homophobic. I mean, Le Pen is probably homophobic and has had homophobic positions before. Her party still does, but they still argue. They basically find somebody else that they dislike more and use the gay community and the LGBT community. But I say gay very specifically because they don't think about trans people in this case, to kind of fight the other, right? So basically what it means is that when sexuality becomes more normalized and mainstream, it enters other conversations of securitization. So securitization is an aspect of how we view our security. Securitization happened at 9/11 when we all had to go through checkpoints at airports. That's securitization of our rights. Counterterrorism is one where it's used, and that's why I asked, what kind of immigrants are we talking about? Primarily, a lot of these people will talk about Arabs, Arab Muslims, because for them, it's easy to exploit the stereotype that Muslims are necessarily against LGBT rights, and therefore they're saying gays vote for us because we're going to keep the people that hate you away. Even though ironically, they are also the people that hated us just 5 years ago and still now, but maybe are just quiet about it. But interestingly, a lot of these far-right politicians now are gay themselves. So you can see that gay people took it on themselves, right? I think the leader or one of the deputies of Le Pen's party is gay, or one of her advisors. One of the most famous Dutch far-right politicians who was assassinated in 2004, Pim Fortuyn, he was gay as well. Can somebody tell me who these two men are? I mean, you must know one of them, right? Okay, he literally has the flag of Lithuania behind him. So who's the one on the right? Who's the Debatų centras guy? please, you're doomed in debate if you don't know that level of current affairs in your own country. Yes.
Person on the right, Laurynas Kasčiūnas.
Yes. Oh, thank God somebody knows. Yeah, Laurynas Kasčiūnas, famously very homophobic within his now less homophobic party, although they were extremely homophobic just 10 years ago. They were the ones that passed the law, primarily them, against kind of censorship in Lithuania to protect kids and things like that. So he is still homophobic in the sense that he holds very homophobic positions on domestic policy. Like he votes against same-sex partnerships. He definitely wouldn't even consider adoption or marriage and those kinds of issues. However, he once said in a comment, I think I got into a fight with him, or maybe it was separate somewhere, that, you know, he foresees that gay people are going to start voting for him and other right-wing people because they're the ones keeping Muslims away in this country and immigrants away in this country that would harm LGBT rights. He's a very interesting person who might become the leader of the main parties in Lithuania soon. Definitely follow what he's doing because things are going to change if he does that quite a lot in Lithuania. Does anyone know who the guy on the left is? Maybe a bit harder, but shouldn't be that. He's not Lithuanian. Doesn't look very Lithuanian, whatever that means. That's Geert Wilders. He is the kind of leader, won the elections in the Netherlands just last year, I think end of last year. No, beginning of this year. He is famously Islamophobic, famously anti-immigrant, basically the Le Pen of France, but a lot more progressive on social issues. Probably because the Netherlands is also a lot more progressive on some of these issues, arguably. If you ask my Dutch friend, he would probably have huge issues for me saying that. But yeah, so he was saying exactly the same thing. One of his policies is banning the Quran, and I think banning mosques, which is ridiculous and would never be allowed. But he does argue for these things in kind of incorporating LGBT rights and gay rights, and has famously done so for a very, very long time. Probably one of the oldest far-right people who has started doing that. You have more silly examples. Twinks for Trump. I found it hilarious when this was a thing. I mean, twink is just a slang term for a slim, young, gay guy. And obviously, Trump in 2016, when he ran for the election for the first time, his vice president was Mike Pence, who was basically like, I don't know, like he was just waiting for the second rapture, you know, for the first rapture or whatever. Like he was so godly and so violently homophobic that it was ridiculous to conceive that some gays would vote for Trump because at the time, gay marriage had just passed. We didn't know, they didn't know if it was going to hold, but there were people advocating for him. One of the Trump surrogates, Milo Yiannopoulos, was this gay man who really hated himself and kind of advocated against his own rights in domestic policy as well. So you even get these examples where they're not arguing for something in particular, but they're just arguing against their own interests, and that happens as well. So that was domestic policy, like immigration, etc. Does anyone know how homonationalism happens in foreign policy? Maybe somebody can give me an example. I have 3 examples here, but if somebody can shoot first, that's great.
I mean, Palestine comes to mind.
Yeah.
And when, like, I guess the far right criticizes queer movement for standing with Palestine,
Yeah.
and then justifies it with like, oh, they're homophobic over there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not just the far right, right? A lot of the justifications inside Israel, and outside of Israel for even in Lithuania, very Zionist advocates would say that uh, it's obviously better, it's fine to kind of go to war because we have to protect this Israel, which is a bastion of human rights, especially gay rights in the Middle East, and everyone else is quote unquote uncivilized evil because they want to, I don't know, behead gays, kill gays. The very common stereotype is throw gays off rooftops, which, happened. I think there was a documented case of that in somewhere in Gaza once in the last 20 years. I wouldn't want to go into statistics of how many gay people have been killed in the last 20 years in Lithuania as well. But obviously there's a very kind of stereotypized image of a particular community. And it's not to say that they're invaded for that reason, but their further invasions of their land or bombing campaigns of their land are justified under the guise of, well, we're still like the good army that does good things because we're going to protect queer people. Obviously, that's not true because there are so many queer Palestinians and they're getting bombed and are dying. I mean, it's also not to say that Israel, which has a huge very influential ultra-Orthodox community. And I think they don't have marriage as well for gays. It is not necessarily actually a bastion of rights in many ways and many standards. But that's often how that homonationalism is portrayed in foreign policy. More specifically in Uganda, very directly, Barack Obama imposed sanctions or cut aid because in Uganda they passed a bill or were passing a bill that would basically give the death penalty for homosexuality. This was in 2014. They actually did pass a similar law finally recently, a few years ago, and Biden threatened sanctions again. Whether that works or not, on either sides, by the way, is obviously something that you can think about and be questionable about. But yeah, you could definitely think about these examples are very useful examples, and you'll see more of them. Can anyone think of how homonationalism in foreign policy happens for us, very relevant way for Lithuanians? Obviously, Israel-Palestine is relevant, but a more close kind of conflict to us. And maybe you might see this as slightly less depressing way of using homonationalism. Russia, right? Can somebody explain how this happens? If they have any idea, take a guess. Let's pick on someone who debated for a long time and hasn't really spoken. Reus. I don't know if you're still here, but let's try.
Yes, I'm here. So what
Great.
was the question?
So how do LGBT rights or LGBT people, how are they used in the context of the conflict between Russia, the war between Russia and Ukraine?
So I think it's kind of similar what we talked about the Palestine, I think is especially yeah, I don't know, just I don't know what else to add.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is similar in the sense that often in the West you would say the Russian state is very homophobic, which it is. And obviously the battle to protect Ukraine is not just for Ukraine, but it's for the ideal of human rights, which encompasses LGBT rights that Russian President Putin is against, etc. And it goes both ways, right? Russia also says the same, but the reverse. I mean, one of the justifications at the very beginning is the perversity and the Nazism, which includes LGBT rights, that was so prevalent in Ukraine, which is also like a very interesting thing for them to say. But you would have Orthodox priests arguing for the invasion and justifying the invasion for exactly those reasons, right? So so that's something to think about as kind of examples, and it will come up in many areas. And it's kind of similar to how feminism has been used as well in a lot of these cases. Let's say Afghanistan and an invasion, the kind of war against the Taliban, and things like that. So I want to end, and the last thing that I will say is, because we're talking about post-LGBT rights where it has been achieved, it hasn't in a lot of the world. Where it has been achieved, it hasn't been achieved fully. But I wanted to kind of leave you with the thought that, we all have different identities in ourselves. I am a queer person. I am also Lithuanian. I am a white person. I'm an immigrant. All of these, whether I like it or not, are important aspects of my identity. But I am notoriously known as a single issue person who only talks about gay rights all the time with his friends, because that is a part of my identity that I think is most under siege. Although I would argue now that my immigration status is pretty under siege in the UK as well. So when a part of your identity is more under attack than others, what happens is that it will maybe become something that's more valued or primary to your life and political demands. So that's why there was a very strong, tight-knit 80s, 70s, 90s, especially 90s with AIDS, social movement of gay people being really, really incredibly radical on these topics. But as those become less under attack, as more society becomes accepting of it, or as you get more rights, other identities come back in. So class, race, religion, gender identity. You will get really, really rich gays like Peter Thiel, who funds Trump's campaigns, who funds a lot of conservative politicians, because he frankly couldn't care less about those things, because what then becomes more important to him is to maintain his billionaire business, which is Palantir, right? And others as well. So those things might come into contact more, or your whiteness might become more important as you become afraid of the floods of immigrants, for example, in your country. That might overtake sexuality for you. So, and I think this is so similar across all characteristics, right? You can say the same for Latinos in the US who have voted for Trump way more this year because maybe things like inflation become more important as they feel less under siege if they are or have been immigrants for a long time or citizens and are not threatened by, let's say, deportation, right? So this is true for everyone. Just 10 years ago, or maybe not 10 years ago, but 20 years ago, you wouldn't really think about Ukraine and Ukrainians in such a distinctive way. And now you would find out that you will hear a lot more people emphasizing their Ukrainian heritage if they have it. And of course, the reason for that is because of the horrible war that's happening in Ukraine right now that was started by Russia. So good things to think about in general in debate on these topics. I hope that this was not really useful, but somewhat useful. I hope that this wasn't very repetitive for a lot of you, and this would be kind of good context for debate. A lot of it is a bit random. So it's just my thoughts on some of the issues that I tend to kind of engage with a lot. But now I was told to leave time for questions. I will answer questions